Hi there, I'm Roland Czada from the University of Osnabrück, and I welcome you to today's class of the Sharing Perspectives Foundation. I will be talking about the macroeconomic imbalances and the sovereign debt in the Eurozone. To grasp the problem, I want to show you a simulation first on sovereign debts in some European countries. Here you see general government lending or borrowing in percent of GDP. Here we have the general government gross debt in percent of GDP. Borrowing is on an annual basis, so this is net annual borrowing. General government gross debt is the accumulated debt over the decades. So we start in 1980, and you see Belgium is the country most indebted compared to those. Here you see Greece is just in the middle of the European family. The problem, one could say, is Belgium. Now we move through the decades. Belgium gets better in terms of annual borrowing, gets worse again, gets better a bit, but is still in 1985 a highly indebted country. Now Italy comes in, Greece moves to the right. Now we have these countries highly indebted, here those with lower sovereign debt GDP ratio. Now we move forward to the year 2000. This is when the euro was introduced, and move forward. Nothing happens. Now, in 2008, the American subprime crisis started, and now look what happens. Greece moves to the right and back a bit. So in 2014, that's this year, Greece is among these countries the one with the highest government gross debt burdens and a country with high borrowing per year. Now, the question is, why? Why did Greece move to the right on this figure? I will answer this question, or maybe you can answer this question at the end of the lesson. Now we come to our topic, macroeconomic imbalances and sovereign debt in the Eurozone. I will first talk about the relevance of the euro crisis, then introduce some facts, particularly on heterogeneity in a monetary union. Then I will talk about the causes. Where does heterogeneity come from, and why does it matter? What are the consequences? And point 4, we will end the lesson with drawing lessons and talk about future prospects. I've some assumptions that we should bear in mind. The first is, concerning the relevance, that the Eurozone crisis poses a massive threat for democracy and welfare in Europe and beyond. Assumption number 2 on heterogeneity. I'd say diversity is fine in culture, language, or whatever you think, but it may be not fine in the European Monetary Union. So we are people in support of the European Union and the Euro always praise diversity, how nice it is, but when it comes to the Eurozone and the Eurozone crisis, we will see that diversity might be the major problem. Now the causes I will show, the deep causes are to be found in the varieties of national productive systems that perpetuate the crisis, that cause the crisis and perpetuate the crisis. And then, fourth, the lessons and future prospects. The political actors, EU, IMF, and others, have to decide in a situation of a dilemmatic choice. Maybe, that's what you can read in newspapers, the choice is either to have deeper integration or disintegration of the European Union. Now, the relevance of the Eurozone crisis. This crisis bears the risk of a breakup of the European currency union, of bankruptcies among major EU banks and beyond, a worldwide economic collapse, rising unemployment up to mass unemployment, rise of political protests up to violent political extremism, and a legitimation crisis, that is a crisis of democracy, with a possibility even of a breakdown of democracy, as happened in Weimar Germany, for instance, long ago. This is quite a threat. Peace in Europe, which is a founding public good of the European community, could end up in deep confrontation and a return of violent conflict. So this is a crisis that we have to take it very serious. Now, I will come back to another simulation. We've learned about the indebtedness of the countries, but indebtedness is not the only problem. One of the major problems is the interconnection of national and regional economies. If you look here, for instance, Greece is indebted with a GDP debt ratio of 166%. That means Greek sovereign debts amount to 166% of its annual gross domestic product. And the borrowers of Greece are French banks. Greece owes French banks $54 billion, German banks $19 billion, Portuguese banks 10, and so forth. Now look at Italy, 121% of its GDP, this is the amount of debt, owes French banks, $366 billion. We can go through here. Germany, for instance, owes $111 billion. This is in dollar because it's a simulation scenario from the New York Times, but you can get the euro numbers if you want with the exchange rate ratio. So German borrowers owe Italian banks and Japanese banks. So it's all interconnected. Interesting is Japan. Japan is a country with the highest debt ratio, 233%. And we will pose a question later, why is Japan not threatened by such a high indebtedness, whereas Greek, with 166%, is real in danger. $166. So, and here these lines show you the whole system. And the trouble is that a country like Greece amassed a huge debt that it has scant hope of repaying. It can't repay, though the country has to be rescued. There are several scenarios. I can't go in this in detail because of our time restrictions. The threat is based on contagion. That is, if a bank or if a country like Greece defaults, the banks in France and Germany who borrowed the money to Greece will also default, go bankrupt, and so on. And in the end, the whole system of world finance could collapse with disastrous consequences for the economy and general welfare. Now, what are the major indicators of heterogeneity? One is interest rates. Here you see the road to the euro and beyond in terms of interest rates, in this case 10 years government bonds 1993 to 2013. So in 1993 Greece paid very high interest rates for the borrowings they made. Germany, relatively low interest rates. And what you can see, all these countries converge to Germany. We have a timeline of government indebtedness in some EU countries, and this is what the euro, this is the ideal situation. But now in 2008, new divergence comes up. Greece again. In Greece, interest rates rise again to the skies, they rocket. And in Germany, interest rates decrease almost to zero. So Germany gets cheap money, Germany can invest based on cheap money, whereas Greece is very much strained by high interest rates, can't repay its bonds, and has to be rescued. Now the question is, why did this new divergence happen from 2008 onwards? Maybe you remember that in 2008 we had the euro crisis, not the euro crisis, sorry, the American subprime crisis, and American banks got squeezed. One, the Lehman Bank went bankrupt even. So the financial markets got dried out in a way, and there was no more easy money, cheap money for countries like Greece, because the investors did not trust Greece anymore to be able to repay their debts. So, as we see, ever since the creation of the Eurozone, the implied risk of sovereign debt in the weaker countries fell, converging towards that of Germany. And this was largely because investors believed that not only would monetary union improve economic growth across the area, but also that weak countries would find support from stronger neighbors in tough economic times. For instance, Portugal struggled to register any economic growth over the last 10 years, but still its yield remained stable relative to Germany's. So from 2000 onwards, we had rapidly falling interest rates, particularly for Greece, and this tempted governments and consumers into debts. As you know, interest rates are the price for money. If the price for money falls, the economy is being flooded with financial liquidity and would eventually overheat. The wages are on the rise, and asset bubbles build up. Such bubbles like housing market booms or general investment booms that happened in Greece, Spain, and even in Portugal would eventually overheat, and such developments are usually fueled by low borrowing costs. And eventually the bubble bursts, assets become suddenly devaluated, owners and investors lose money. The deeper the crisis, the more of these countries fail to fulfill their payment obligations, especially when their debts become due, must be repaid. Thus the crisis strains banks and banking systems. In principle, there are only two ways out of the crisis. Either we see bankruptcies or we see bailouts. To let borrowers go bankrupt, of course, affects the lenders. They, mostly banks, would not get their money back and thus lose assets. A financial chain reaction would cause a complete breakdown of the economy, massive losses of employment and taxes, and the fall of social welfare systems. So it seems that bailouts by governments and the central bank are the only way to stop such chain reaction. There is also a way between both bailout and default that had been practiced in the Greek case. That is a bailout with a haircut, meaning the bank lost part of their loans, that the debts are cut at a certain level, and nevertheless, such a country, Greek in our case, must get new lendings. So in any case, new debts are needed to refinance the expiring ones. And all this can only be done with cheap money, otherwise the economy would collapse. Consequently, the central bank lowers its key lending rate, and this floods the financial markets with new money and thus prevents the financial distress of a horrifying liquidity crisis. Now, why did the interest rates converge here? Why did this happen? And why did this convergence freeze for some years? First of all, because investors continued to think in terms of one currency and one rate after the euro was introduced. They did not care for the economic heterogeneity and the resulting dangers for the eurozone. Or maybe investors aren't as stupid. Who knows? They may have known that Greece and Germany have been worlds apart when it comes to economic performance and good finances. Maybe lending to Greece was quite simply a bet that the Eurozone countries or the European Central Bank would bail each other out and take over each other's debt in a crisis. So now we are at the question of heterogeneity. What kind of heterogeneity matters, and why did investors, the banks, and politicians not recognize early that heterogeneity might be a problem? Now, this is annual sovereign debt rollover. That means every year some debts have to be repaid and others have to be taken anew to be able to repay the old bonds lending. Now, there are huge differences between Estonia and Greece. Greece has to repay debts every year. They have a high debt rollover, much higher than in any other country. So here you can see in the following years which country would have to repay which amount of money as percent of GDP. And we have very detailed data on when this happens, when Greece has to repay money. Then the other, I will come back to that. Let's go first to the varieties of capitalism. The Greek capitalism is very different to the German one. There are different industrial relation systems and wage regimes that lead to different wage developments. Look here, starting in 1970, the compensation of employees per employee rose steepest in Italy, high in United Kingdom, France, but the increase in wages was much lower in Germany. Here we have the same picture starting in 1996 to 2014. And you see Germany has got a very continuous development of wages, whereas wages almost exploded in Greece. And you can't see the euro didn't change this. So we have countries, notably the Southern European countries, who experienced massive increases in wages since decades, not only since the introduction of the euro. The picture becomes even worse when you compare the development of unit labor costs. Unit labor costs measure the average costs of labor per unit of output and are calculated as the ratio of total labor cost to real output. So in this case, wages are related to industrial performance, and if unit labor costs rise, a country's competitiveness suffers. And here, interestingly, unit labor costs decreased in Germany after 2005, and after 2008 there's a slight increase, whereas again Greece, the red dotted line, or almost all other countries, 80 is Austria, experienced steep rises of unit labor costs, and that means that the international competitiveness of the economy has been deteriorated by this development. Their products became more expensive due to high labor costs and missing productivity gains. Now, to take this together, poor structural competitiveness is one here. Poor structural competitiveness is one of the factors of crises that differ across the Eurozone. So here, Greece and Portugal are here, poor structural competitiveness in a three-dimensional space. Then the other differences we have is the quality of state and government management, sound financial management. It's poor in Greece, poorest in Greece, poor in Portugal, Italy, Spain, even France. So here we have the poor quality of state government management, poor structural competitiveness, and another point is light touch regulation of finance. That means neoliberal liberalization. So Ireland suffered from a loss of regulation, and Greece in particular suffered from poor quality of state, government and management, and also from poor industrial competitiveness. Whereas the countries here, the countries of the virtuous Northern Europe, Germany, Finland, Netherlands, for instance, are better when it comes to the quality of state, better when it comes to international competitiveness, and better when it comes to the regulation of the economy. Now, how could Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain move here? This is the question the policymakers have to pose and to solve. They have to deal with a north-south divide, that you all know, and that means that the northern economies, Netherlands, Finland, Germany, for instance, enjoy a good fit with the evolution of the world economy, with an effective and reactive state, cooperative trade unions, and a relative, even imperfect, control over public finances. They fare relatively well in terms of external surplus, the ability to reduce a public deficit, and thus they can comply with the EU and Eurozone rules rather easily and ask to their partners to do so. Now, the southern economies suffer from a structural lack of competitiveness, a limited ability of the state and labor market organizations to intervene efficiently. Some of them have suffered from real estate speculative bubbles generated by financial liberalization. Ireland, for instance. Given the persisting public deficits and the deterioration of their trade balances, it is very difficult for them, the southern economies, to stick to the adjustment programs negotiated with the EU and IMF, austerity programs, less public spending, lower wages, and privatization, and so on. The heterogeneity of the Eurozone is still larger when one takes into account three hybrid configurations. France is an intermediate case between North and South. Greece is an exceptional case of clear and largely irreversible insolvency, and Ireland is a failed tiger perverted by a careless financial liberalization, but with a large capacity to rebound back to a viable export-led regime. The deepest cause of the differences we are talking about, in my eyes, are different wage-setting practices and industrial relations systems. The way how employers and workers are organized and interact are crucial factors when it comes to explain the economic problems of the southern countries and their loss in industrial competitiveness in particular. That's what we have seen. The differences in how these capitalisms work, how the financial systems work, how the public sector, the state, the government, and the administration works. Now, heterogeneity we also find in terms of political systems. I don't want to go deeper into that now, but point to the threats for democracy and legitimacy in the Eurozone member countries. Look at the political consequences of the Euro crisis. The Eurobarometer reports a loss of trust in the EU since the beginning of the EU and accelerating after and in the wake of the crisis. So the loss of trust is highest in the southern economies, in the southern countries. Greece, extreme loss, from almost 80% confidence to less than 20%. This is a complete collapse of trust. Then Spain, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands, quite a bit of loss, and Germany also, and Finland with a very small loss in trust. Now, satisfaction with democracy. In Finland, the Netherlands, Austria and Germany, satisfaction with democracy between 2007 and 2012 even increased, whereas in the southern countries, satisfaction with democracy decreased, most dramatically in Greece, down to 10%. Only 10% of the Greek are satisfied with democracy. We have also a big decrease in Spain, and this shows clear that economic crises matter when it comes to the legitimation of a political system and to the satisfaction with democracy. Now, what is the way out? This is a simple way. Eurozone gives Greece partial debt forgiveness. Now Italy demands it too, and that would be a kind of chain reaction in demands for rescue. And Europe's bailout mechanism gets overheated. There isn't enough money to save them all, and in the end we would have a severe European banking crisis and a liquidity crisis. Then here the Eurozone doesn't let Greece restructure its debt, force Greece to spend less, but nevertheless Greece defaults. We would also have a European banking crisis. Or one could let Greece continue as is, with massive credibility loss and, as a consequence, a severe European banking crisis. So it's all worse, bad and even worse here. This is a contrastive black and white perspective. Here you see, we come now to the end of the lecture. Here we see a more differentiated scenario of future developments. The one possibility is fiscal union. That means European government, European fiscal policy, Eurobonds. That means the European financial system gets united. And we would also get the transfer union then, so that the northern countries transfer money to the south in order to stabilize them. This, economists say, bears a growth potential in it, and the probability that this will happen would be, economists again say, 25%. Then the monetization of debt by the ECB, the European Central Bank, that's what we have now. The European Central Bank buys bonds from the indebted southern states and saves the euro. 35% mild growth of the European economies as a whole would be the consequence. Then the blue euro and the red euro, that means a northern euro and a southern euro. This would cause maybe a political burst and also cause a mild recession. Then we could replace the euro by a new D-Mark zone. That means we would reintroduce in Germany the German mark, the Deutsche Mark, and the other currencies would orient themselves or be bound to this D-Mark, so the German mark, the new German mark, and that would mean that we have a kind of a coordinated monetary policy and currency and exchange rate policy, and at the same time we would have the full sovereignty of states, a scenario that bears global systemic risks. And the last one that would cause a deep recession is an implosion of 17 national currencies. That means a breakdown of the whole European financial system with very severe consequences. So we will see. I think the most probable case is that, 35%, or that, with relatively mild consequences. Now I will come back to the indebtedness problem for Greece. We started with the question, why is indebtedness a problem for Greece? Knowing that Japan, for instance, is much more indebted than Greece in terms of debt in relation to GDP. There are three reasons for that. Greece, as we have seen, has a weak economy, much less competitive than the economies in the European North. So investors would not trust Greece to be able to repay the money they get. So the European Central Bank has to buy Greek bonds in order to prevent default of Greece. Second, Greece is a member of the Eurozone. If Greece would not be a member of the Eurozone, like Sweden or Japan or the United States, Greece could devaluate her currency. They cannot devaluate their currency now because they don't have one. So they cannot adapt to changing conditions of their economy and competitiveness. And the third point is, Greece is indebted outside its country, its foreign debt that they have to repay, whereas Japan, for instance, is a creditor to her own citizens. So it's Japanese citizens who borrow their money to the Japanese state. Japan can never get bankrupt because there are no foreign lenders wanting their money back. Their own citizens, it's not a problem. Japan can raise the taxes, for instance, get the money from the citizens and give them the borrowings back. So for Greece, this is and maybe other southern countries, this is a pessimistic perspective. We must hold that the euro crisis can, in a short perspective, only be solved by money transfers, and in a longer perspective, only be solved when the political economy, the political system, the administrative system, the tax system, and the national governance of Greece will get better. Thank you very much, and see you again when we are talking about the German case in the euro crisis. Thank you very much.